I always knew. Even before I had the words to define it, I knew I wasn't wanted, not in the way my brothers were. It wasn't loud or obvious. It wasn't some dramatic rejection. No, it was quieter than that. 1,000 little things, so small they could almost be ignored. Almost. The way my mother would beam with pride at my brothers but barely glance at me. The way my father's voice softened when speaking to them but turned cold, clipped, when addressing me. I was there, tolerated, but never truly seen. A daughter, yes, but not the kind that mattered. Love in our house was never unconditional. My brothers were celebrated for the simplest things, a passing grade, a half-hearted attempt at sports. I had to be exceptional just to earn a nod of approval. I brought home straight A's, won debate competitions, outshined everyone in every room I walked into. And yet, the only thing my father ever said was, "That's nice, but none of this will matter when you get married." As if my ambition was nothing more than a temporary distraction. As if my only true purpose was to become someone's wife. The rules in our house were unspoken, but rigid. My brothers were taught to take up space, to lead, to dream. I was taught to be small, to listen, to accept. When I dared to question it, my mother would sigh, shaking her head. "It's just the way things are, Lana. Women have their roles, men have theirs. Stop trying to fight it." But I never stopped fighting. Not even when I was too young to understand what I was fighting against. By the time I was old enough to make my own choices, I had already decided. I would never live the life they wanted for me. I worked harder, climbed higher, forced my way into spaces where I was never meant to belong. Top of my class, prestigious law firm, high-profile cases. I built a life no one could take from me. But at home, within the walls of the family I had spent my whole life trying to impress, I was still just Lana. No matter how much I achieved, nothing changed. And maybe, deep down, I had always known it wouldn't. I stopped trying to earn their approval the day I realized it was never mine to have. It wasn't about me, not really. It was about the fact that I was born in the wrong body, the wrong gender, the wrong fate. My father would never look at me the way he looked at my brothers, full of pride and expectation. My mother would never tell stories about me the way she did about them, as if their victories were family triumphs and mine were nothing more than footnotes. I was always the afterthought, the one who was there, but not the one who mattered. I used to think if I was enough, they would have to see me. Smart enough, successful enough, accomplished enough. If I worked harder, proved myself over and over, they would have no choice but to acknowledge me. But I was wrong. No matter how many times I proved my worth, their view of me remained the same. My father would chuckle dismissively whenever I talked about my career, as if my success was a hobby rather than an achievement. My brothers never asked about my work, never treated me as an equal. To them, I was still just the little girl who tagged along, the one they tolerated but never took seriously. The worst part? I let it hurt me for far too long. I carried that wound everywhere I went, buried it beneath polished smiles and perfect performances. I told myself I didn't care, but deep down, I did. I wanted to believe that if I kept pushing forward, I'd leave their disappointment behind. That my success would be enough to drown out the voice in my head that whispered, "They'll never see you. Not the way you want them to." But I was done waiting for their validation, done shrinking myself in hopes they'd finally let me in. I had spent my whole life playing by their rules, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. And now, I was ready to break it. The shift happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic declaration. Just a slow, steady realization that I didn't need them. I didn't need their approval, their pride, their reluctant nods of acknowledgement. I had built myself from the ground up without their help, without their encouragement, and if they never saw my worth, that was their blindness to bear, not mine. Still, the weight of their indifference clung to me, like an old scar that refused to fade. I carried it into the courtroom, into the late nights spent poring over case files, into the long hours where I proved, again and again, that I was someone to be reckoned with. People feared me, respected me. My name carried weight. And yet, when I walked into my parents' house, I was still just the daughter. the one who was meant to stand behind, to watch, to listen, but never to lead. I learned to smile through it, to let their dismissiveness roll off me like rain against glass. But deep down, I kept a tally. Every slight, every time they undermined me, every moment they acted as if my life was nothing more than a placeholder until I became a wife and mother. They thought I had accepted my place, that I had learned to live with the way things were. They had no idea. Grief is supposed to bring families together. That's what people say, isn't it? That in the face of loss, all the petty conflicts and old wounds dissolve, leaving only love and shared memories. But as I sat in the lawyer's office, listening to the formal reading of my parents' will, I realized something. Some families don't heal in grief. Some use it as an opportunity to wound even deeper. I had come here expecting, no, not expecting, hoping for something different. A recognition, at least. A final acknowledgement that I was as much a part of this family as my brothers. After all, I had done everything right. I had been the responsible one, the one who never needed rescuing, who built her own success. I had been there, always. But when the lawyer's voice droned on, listing every asset, every property, every bank account, my name never came. Everything. Everything had gone to my brothers. I didn't move. Didn't blink. The room felt airless, suffocating, but I kept my face still, unreadable. Years of practice had taught me that. Show nothing. Feel nothing. But inside, something sharp and cold settled in my chest. Something final. I barely heard the rest of it. Numbers, deeds, business shares, all assigned, all accounted for, all placed neatly in my brother's hands. Not a single hesitation. Not a single mention of me. It was as if I had never existed, as if I had been nothing more than a distant relative, an outsider looking in. The lawyer didn't even pause, didn't even glance in my direction, as if my presence in the room was just a formality. And then, as if on cue, came the justification. My eldest brother, Daniel, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You know how it is, Lana," he said, voice dripping with false sympathy. "The family name continues through men, not women." The others chuckled, casual, relaxed, like this was the most natural thing in the world, like my entire life's worth had just been erased, and it was barely worth discussing. "You're a woman," they told me. "You don't need land. You'll marry. You'll have a husband to provide for you." I should have felt rage, should have stood up, screamed, demanded answers, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled. A slow, careful smile, and nodded, like I understood, like I agreed, because in that moment I knew something they didn't. They had taken everything from me. But they had also made the biggest mistake of their lives. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, but I kept my posture relaxed, my expression unreadable. I had spent my whole life learning how to mask disappointment, how to swallow the sting of rejection. This was no different. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Of course," I said smoothly, as if the decision made perfect sense. "It's tradition, after all." Daniel grinned, like I had finally learned my place. My youngest brother, Lucas, clapped me on the back, as if I had just accepted some long-overdue truth. "See? No hard feelings," he said. "You should be grateful, Lana. You don't have to worry about any of this." Grateful. The word echoed in my mind, a dull throb beneath the quiet hum of my thoughts. They actually believed I would accept this, that I would smile and fade into the background, just like I always had. That I would take my place in the shadows and let them carry on as if I had never been here at all. I gave them one last look, letting the moment stretch, memorizing the smugness in their faces, the ease with which they dismissed me. Then I turned to the lawyer, extended my hand, and thanked him for his time. When I left that office, I wasn't the same woman who had walked in. They thought this was the end of the story. They had no idea. It was just the beginning. Revenge isn't about anger. It's not about lashing out or losing control. It's about precision, patience, knowing exactly when to strike. As I sat in my office that night, Staring at the skyline beyond the window, I felt nothing but clarity. No rage, no grief, just a steady, quiet understanding of what needed to be done. My brothers had spent their lives underestimating me, dismissing me. They thought they had won, that I was out of the game, but they had no idea I had already started playing. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, and opened my laptop. If they had given me my rightful share, I would have let it go. I would have walked away, let them keep their illusion of power. But they had made a mistake. They had assumed I was powerless, that I would accept defeat. They had no idea that I knew the law better than any of them, that I had spent years unraveling legal loopholes, studying the cracks in contracts, learning the very system they had used to push me aside. And now? Now I was going to use it against them. I started where they least expected, inside their own empire. I knew every property they owned, every business deal they'd ever made. But I also knew something they didn't. Power is never as secure as people think it is. It's built on contracts, clauses, loopholes, things most people don't bother to read. But I did. And what I found? It was enough to bury them. Tax fraud, hidden debts, unregistered properties, business dealings that were legally questionable at best, criminal at worst. My brothers had spent years moving money around, cutting corners, avoiding regulations. And they had been sloppy, too comfortable, too sure of their untouchability. They never expected someone like me, someone they had written off, to be the one digging through their secrets. I worked quietly, methodically. I gathered documents, pieced together evidence, contacted the right people. Not just lawyers, journalists, auditors, government agencies. One by one, I built the case against them. And the best part? They had no idea it was happening. Not yet. They thought I had accepted my place, that I was done fighting. They were wrong. Patience was key. Revenge wasn't about making them suffer in a single moment. It was about watching them unravel, piece by piece, without ever realizing who was pulling the strings. I moved carefully, making sure every step was untraceable. Anonymous tips to regulatory agencies, strategic leaks to financial journalists, a quiet, well-timed audit request. I didn't need to lie. I only had to show the right people where to look. My brothers had built their fortune on arrogance, on the belief that no one would dare challenge them. They had gotten away with bending the rules for years, but no one is untouchable forever. And the best part? While their world was beginning to crack, they still saw me as harmless. Poor Lana, left with nothing. I let them believe it, smiled when they made their condescending remarks, nodded when they told me to move on. They thought I had surrendered. They didn't know I was already holding the match, ready to burn everything down. It started with a phone call. One of my brothers, Lucas, calling Daniel in the middle of the day, his voice tight, anxious. Something about a flagged transaction, an issue with the bank. I imagined Daniel brushing it off, telling him not to worry. But then came the second call, and the third. Suddenly, it wasn't just a bank issue. It was accounts being frozen. Business transactions being halted. Investments locked in place, unavailable. I was at my desk when I got the message, a vague, half-panicked text from Daniel. "Something's wrong with the accounts. You hear anything?" I stared at the screen, letting the moment sink in. This was it, the first domino tipping over. I took a sip of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and typed my response. No idea. Hope it's nothing serious. I hit send and smiled. The panic spread faster than I expected. Within 24 hours, my brother's entire financial structure was in chaos. One by one, their bank accounts were locked for compliance issues. Their businesses, so carefully shielded, were suddenly under investigation. Government agencies started making calls. Auditors began asking questions. And just like that, the walls they had built around themselves started to crumble. I knew exactly what was happening, of course. I had orchestrated it. Every missing document, every unfiled report, every hidden liability, I had exposed them all, piece by piece. The system they had manipulated for years was finally turning against them, and they had no idea how or why. Another text from Daniel. Lana, something's really wrong. We need to talk. I almost laughed. Now he wanted to talk? Now that everything was slipping through his fingers? I could picture them, my brothers, pacing, arguing, trying to figure out who had betrayed them. They would never suspect me. To them, I was still just their sister, the one they had left behind. That's what made this so perfect. The first news article dropped the next morning. A quiet, well-researched piece about financial irregularities in my family's businesses. Nothing too damning, yet. Just enough to plant doubt, to make people start watching. By noon, calls from investors were flooding in. By evening, the second article landed, this one digging deeper. That was when the real damage began. Contracts were pulled, clients backed out, business partners started distancing themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. And my brothers? They were scrambling, trying to contain the leaks, to silence the questions, but it was too late. A third text from Daniel, more desperate this time. Lana, you need to call me. This is serious. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. Busy. Hope you figure it out. Then I turned off my phone, leaned back in my chair, and let the weight of my victory settle in. They still didn't know it was me, but soon they would. By the time my brothers realized the full extent of the damage, it was already irreversible. Lawsuits were piling up. Banks were demanding answers. Government agencies had officially launched investigations. Every asset they once controlled, the businesses, the properties, the carefully built empire, was slipping through their fingers. That was when the begging started. First, it was Lucas, always the weakest of the three. He called, voice strained, asking if I could use my connections to fix this mess. Then came Daniel, trying a different approach. Calm, measured, like he could still manipulate his way out of this. Lana, we can work something out. We're family. I let them talk. Let them grasp at whatever little dignity they had left. Then, finally, I said what I had been waiting to say for years. You didn't think a woman was capable of running a business, but it looks like a woman was capable of taking yours down. Silence, heavy, crushing. For the first time, they finally understood. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything left unsaid. For years, they had laughed at me, dismissed me, pushed me aside like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Now, all that arrogance had turned to desperation. Lana, please, Lucas finally choked out. We didn't mean... I cut him off. You meant every word. I wanted to savor this moment, to let them sit in the wreckage of their own making. But I wasn't here for closure. I wasn't here to make them understand. I had stopped needing their validation a long time ago. This wasn't about making them see my worth. It was about taking back what was mine. This isn't my problem, I said, my voice steady, final. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. Daniel exhaled sharply, his mask of control cracking. What do you want? I smiled. I already have it. And with that, I hung up. The final blow came 2 weeks later. A court ruling officially transferred ownership of the remaining family assets, the properties, the businesses, the wealth, into my hands. Every last thing they had once hoarded, once claimed as theirs by right, was now legally mine. I didn't do it for the money. I had built my own success long before this. I did it because power was never theirs to begin with. They had inherited it. I had earned it. The day I walked into the family estate, now my estate, was the day I truly closed the door on the past. I stood in the grand hall where my father had once ignored me, where my brothers had once laughed at my ambitions. The house was quiet now, empty, fitting. I poured myself a drink, took a slow sip, and raised my glass to the air. To the unwanted daughter, I murmured. And for the first time in my life, I felt free.